Hello, this is Jonathan Wood from Soft Circuits, and in this video I want to talk about using Unicode characters in your MFC applications. Now, a little history. Unicode is a standard of encoding characters on computers. Traditionally, DOS and Windows computers have used a byte of storage to encode each character, but hundreds of other character encodings exist, which has complicated interoperability between different encoding systems. So Unicode was developed to allow a single encoding system to handle every character in all languages and platforms. For the Windows developer, the main thing to know is that Unicode uses 2 bytes of storage to encode each character instead of 1. This, of course, allows a much greater range of characters possible using this encoding. Now, in reality, things are not quite so simple. Windows has used multi-byte character sequences to encode characters that require more than 8 bits in certain cases. But for the most part, it's helpful to think of traditional character encoding as using 1 byte of storage per character and Unicode as using 2 bytes. So let's create a simple application to demonstrate some of the techniques for dealing with different character encoding. And I'll go ahead and create a new project. And I'll call it Unicode. And I'm going to make this a dialog-based application and accept the rest of the defaults. And I'm going to go ahead and set the ID for this the static control, and we're going to work with that in code. And I'll call it IDC underscore text. And we're going to go to the on-init dialog routine to initialize our dialog box. Now, by default, MSC projects created with Visual Studio 2008 will use Unicode characters. So let's take a look at the settings. Under General, there's a setting called Character Set, and as you can see, the default was to set it to use Unicode Character Set. And the other setting is multi-byte. Now that's a little confusing because if you're thinking of the old style as being 1 byte and Unicode as being 2, multi-byte doesn't seem to really fit. But because sometimes more than 1 byte sequences are required using non-Unicode encoding, it is called multi-byte, and we're setting the Unicode which is a default, and that's what we're going to use for now. So let's say, well, and let me just say the settings in that in the dialog box cause certain constants to be defined and alternate libraries to be linked in order to work with the character types used by your application. Now, Unicode has been adopted by Windows for many years. Initially, it was often implemented as components that wrapped internal Windows functions, converting Unicode strings to multi-byte strings as required. Now these days, Windows uses Unicode characters throughout the operating system. So while you can still run non-Unicode applications on Windows, they are slightly less efficient as system calls often must convert strings to Unicode. So creating an application that uses Unicode characters will run slightly more efficiently on the latest version of Windows. However, one potential downside is such applications may not run on some older versions of Windows. And of course, as time goes on, more and more users will be using newer versions of Windows, and so that'll become less than an issue. So some time ago, Windows started exposing 2 versions of all Windows functions that work with text. Each version has the same name, except that the Unicode version ends in a U for Unicode, and the multi-byte version ends in A for ANSI or ASCII. Now, I want to initialize that static control in our dialog box to demonstrate some of these. Now I'm not going to use the MFC. We're going to just kind of use raw Windows calls here to demonstrate some of these techniques. So get a hold of a window to the control, and then we're going to call set window text, and we pass it our window, and we pass it a string. Now if we try to run that, well, first of all, we get an error because of the not enough arguments there. But the second error we get is this call to set window text. We get it. It gives us the error that we cannot convert parameter 2 from a constant char to LPCW string. Now that might, if you're not familiar with that, that might seem a little strange. But if you notice that while we call set window text, that it actually is calling set window text W, which is the Unicode version. And the error is that the string we're passing it is not a Unicode string, it's a regular string, so there's a mismatch there. Now you can see in the balloon tip there that that set window text is actually defined as set window text W. Now we can easily convert this to a Unicode string by simply putting an L prefix on it, and then if we run it, and I've also forgotten a semicolon, let's try that, and we can see we've set our text to the of the static control, so that does work. Okay, so now what happens if we go and we want to change, we decide that, well, instead of Unicode, we want to use the multi-byte character set. So we're going to change that setting. And now we're going to do a build. And we get an error now. And now, if you look at the set window text, instead of being set window text W, it's now set window text A. And as we indicated, that's the non-Unicode version. So that gives us an error, and the reason is because of that L that makes it a Unicode string. So if we get rid of that and we run our application, let me do a rebuild. So now that works. Well, that's less than ideal, as you probably realize. First of all, anytime you write code, you may not know in advance if you're going to call the be calling the Unicode or the non-Unicode version. But fortunately, there is a macro. It's the _t macro, and by enclosing the text strings within this macro, it will append the L prefix if you're doing a Unicode build, and it won't if it's not a Unicode build. And so you really should get in the habit when writing MFC code, anytime you define a string constant, to use this macro. So now let's try something a little different. Let's create our strings separately. So we create a character pointer, call it PSTR, and it equals a string constant, and we're going to convert it to uppercase, and then we're going to pass it to set window text. And I'm sorry, actually that's going to cause some problems because it's a constant, so we'll do this a little differently. So now if I run that, that works. But now what happens if we go to our properties and we want to change this back to a Unicode build. Now we're going to have a few problems. And as expected, we've got a couple of errors. One of the errors that we're not using the secure version, and we're not going to go into that right yet. But the other one, of course, is that this buffer is not a it's not a Unicode pointed to a Unicode string. And as you can imagine, we could change this to a we could change this to a Unicode string rather, but we don't want to have to change it for each time we change the build. So there is another macro, tchar, and the T stands for type. And by doing this way, on a Unicode build, it specifies that it's a Unicode character, and on a non-Unicode build, it's a single byte character. So we're almost there, but let's try that. And of course, we got one more error. String upper is now complaining because it expects a regular character pointer, and it's getting a Unicode character pointer. So there is a different versions of string upper. For example, there is WCS upper, and that stands for wide character string upper. And if we run that, well, we still have a character, a non-Unicode string, and we know how to fix that by using the _t macro. So let's try that. And again, that's working. But again, the common theme here is we don't have to change the code every time that we change whether or not we're doing a Unicode build. So the _t macro means that our string will change according to the build. The tchar means that our buffer will change according to the build, and the only change we need is this one. And the other variation of this string is _tcs for type character string. Now that should work, and it does. And we can do a build for a non-Unicode. And that should also build. We're getting the same warning for the security warnings, which I'm not concerned about. Also getting a problem with the manifest, and that appears to be related to the fact that I'm changing that, and some of those settings from the previous builds are causing problems. So I'll just do a rebuild all, and it does build. So there's a couple of features, a couple of techniques you can use to make your application both Unicode or non-Unicode, or rather able to compile without errors for either one. If you're still not using Unicode yet, this is definitely something that you should be using when you write code, because you'll almost certainly be wanting to use Unicode in the future. Now, one last thing on the TCS UPR, that goes for all the standard library C string routines. For example, to copy a string, it's strcpy. So there's also a TCS CPY. And all the string routines that begin with str, you simply replace them with the TCS. And those are all the macro versions. And if you do a Unicode build, they'll accept a Unicode string, and if you do a non-Unicode build, then they accept a single byte string. So a little introduction into the difference between Unicode and multi-byte character sets, and how best to deal with them in MFC.